Welcome to Cracking Cancer, where we tackle the tough questions about cancer with real patients and world experts. Our mission is to empower the cancer community through education, bring transparency to the oncology system, and drive funding for critical cancer research. Whether you're facing a diagnosis, supporting a loved one, or simply here to learn, we're here to bring clarity, hope, and action to the fight against cancer.
Hey everyone, welcome to Cracking Cancer. I am your host, Dr. Kyle Concannon. I'm a physician scientist at the University of Colorado, and I'm joined today by Max Doppelt. And we're going to be talking about going to national conferences, the big cancer meetings, and from a patient perspective or from a patient advocacy perspective, what to expect, how to navigate those, and how to make the most out of that time if you choose to go. So Max, maybe you can take a second, introduce yourself, and then we'll kick off here.
Thanks for having me, Kyle. My name is Max Doppelt. I'm a patient advocate and caregiver for my mom. She has an EGFR exon 20 mutation. And over the past 2 years since her diagnosis, I've had an active role in her care and started going to conferences to really learn more about how I could have an impact for her and advocating for her, but then also more broadly. It's been a really useful experience to connect with the industry overall. So I'm really excited to talk to you today about conferences and what it's like to attend them.
Yeah, and I'm interested from I'm a physician scientist. I do experiments. I present at these conferences, and what I get out of them, I think, is it's just a totally different lens from what someone who's actually suffering from cancer or caring for someone who's suffering from cancer. And so I'm curious. I know that it depends a lot on the different type of conference. There's a lot of different cancer conferences. Some are really niche. Some are really broad. And the degree of benefit one may get from it from a patient perspective, I imagine, varies quite a bit. So maybe starting us off, Max, can you tell me what your initial perception was of national conferences for cancer?
Yeah, so the first conference I went to was an IASLC Targeted Therapies Conference, which is this medical research oriented conference. And I was actually attending because one of the trial coordinators that was speaking at the conference was running a trial that I was trying to get my mom on. And I was trying any possible way to get in front of this person's face to understand how to get my mom onto the trial. So it was kind of by accident that I attended this conference. And so this was a lot of medical jargon. When I showed up, it was really confusing to navigate and understand the podiums and the speakers and how research was being presented. So it was definitely a lot to learn up front and challenging to navigate.
Well, and I mean, that's a bold strategy to show up at a conference and just corner the person who's enrolling folks. Is that like functionally what you did?
Yeah, it didn't work. That's not how things work. But in hindsight, it really opened me to this whole avenue because since then I've been to 4 other conferences and I choose to go because I really believe it provides value and a great learning opportunity and networking opportunity. I remember really the first time navigating the hallways of this conference was a bit isolating. I actually had someone who was also attending, a patient advocate who I knew, who took me under her wing and helped introduce me to people, which I think was really important. But what's so amazing is the last time I went and I saw you at the conference a couple weeks ago, it feels like I'm building a sense of community. And I actually am quite excited to attend these conferences and see other patients who've been attending and patient advocates and oncologists and kind of the connections that are made at these conferences. It's great that I feel I can now partake in.
Yeah, I'm curious. It's funny that you've been attending these for about a year now and kind of growing into them. But what did you think this type of conference would be like before you attended? And how is the reality similar or different to that?
Pretty similar. I have an engineering background, so it actually was I had some scientific expectations, thinking about what are the latest and greatest medicines and therapies for my mom's specific mutation, but also more broadly in cancer. And to that end, it was probably a bit underwhelming. I didn't realize almost how much I knew. And so if there was one person who was slotted to speak about exon 20 in this 10-minute time window in a 3-day conference of things that I've attended. And I remember looking at the slides thinking, oh, I've seen those research results already. They've already shared this in the Facebook group I participate in, or just from Googling. So I was a bit underwhelmed or surprised that that I didn't learn more from a medical standpoint, which I'm curious from your perspective, when you go to these conferences, obviously some they're presenting new data, but how much is it about actually learning about what is the latest and greatest?
Yeah, you raise a good point. If I had to make some sort of estimate of how many lung cancer specific conferences, and we're using that as an example, it's true for most cancer types, but we're both in the lung sphere. There's got to be 10 to 20 a year that are going through reiterating on maybe all of these data sets, or subsets of these data sets. Some of them are national meetings, some of them are regional meetings. But if anything is really new, cutting edge, and interesting, it's going to find its way into the patient advocacy organizations pretty quickly. So I'm not surprised to hear that you showed up there and you knew as much as the people who were there to learn about it. And I think this is a point that I've been trying to emphasize a lot to the patients I see, individuals from the podcast, is that if you have a given cancer type, that's a niche thing. Like you're talking about EGFR, certain type of mutation, exon 20, that's a subset of them. If a given patient falls in that bucket, or you have a loved one who falls in that bucket, you're going to quickly know more than 90% of oncologists. And you may even know more than many thoracic oncologists. So that's a given meeting where mostly people are there to learn about lung cancer. They're learning about how practices have changed. And since you can divide lung cancer into many, many buckets, for those who aren't doing the cutting edge research, that may be news to them, the most updated thing, which to you is a year old, but to them, they're kind of just hearing about it now because this is so rare. They may see one in their career. So I think it's a testament to value your level of knowledge if you've been keeping up in a given disease type. And not to say that everyone has to do that. I think your doctor should be up to date on how to treat a given tumor. And if they're not, they need to refer out to the individuals who are, or at least get their opinions on them. But I'm not surprised to hear that you went there, and as someone who's niche, or who's in that field of the EGFR exon 20 groups, that specific type of mutation, you probably knew more about that than 90% of the people there. And that's a lung cancer conference.
It's and it speaks to, I think there are a wide range of different types of conferences that patients can attend. So that medical research oriented conference, I think there are great values in networking and being able to see people in the hallways. And then there's so many other parts of cancer, not just research, that are super important for me as a caregiver and helping my mom live the best life, and thinking about survivorship and what patients endure with financial hardship. And I went to another conference a couple months ago, the ACS, American Cancer Society Lung Cancer Roundtable, and there was no medical data being presented. Not that many oncologists there, but it really provided such a unique lens for me when I attended, because it forced me to think about how I care for my mom and think about patient advocacy more broadly in a totally different lens. And that was something really valuable. So I'm curious, are there other types of conferences that you'll attend that aren't necessarily just medical research oriented, that maybe have a stronger patient presence?
Yeah, I'd say the most patient-facing conference I probably attend is the American Society for Clinical Oncology, and that's abbreviated ASCO. Usually happens every year in Chicago in the summer, in the late spring, early summer. The challenge with that one is that tens of thousands of people are there. It's huge. So there's so much going on. They usually rent out that whole conference center in Chicago, the McCormick Conference Center. So when you have, 30,000 or whatever people at one conference, it can be really hard to drink out of that fire hose, so to speak. And especially if you're a patient and you're kind of new to this world, even just navigating the center and figuring out how to get there, the bus systems, like it's a whole ecosystem. So that one has the full breadth of some elements of the conference are incredibly patient forward. They're talking about subjective experiences. They're talking about access to trials, the lived experience, And then other elements of that are, here are the early phase trials that are starting to read out, things we think are promising. And you may even see those not even as presentations, but as posters. So they have these poster halls where you have thousands of posters for people all over the world who are presenting their most recent data. And some of that data is, like I'm mentioning, early phase data. Here are the new drugs that we think are effective. Some of it is a little more laboratory based, not as laboratory based at this conference, but much of it is still patient outcomes and things like that. But in terms of getting together with patients to work together, I wouldn't say there's as much of that as there could be at the conferences that I attend. But the role that I fill in those conferences is usually coming from the scientific lens, where I'm highlighting data we've generated or things like that, trying to make collaborative connections. So even as I'm growing in this field and better maybe positioning myself for these kinds of collaborations with patient groups, I'm still learning how to get the most out of these conferences too. As you were mentioning, when you first went to that conference that I saw you at last week, the Targeted Therapies conference that we have in lung cancer, it can be really hard to navigate. And that conference is maybe a tenth the size of ASCO. So it's hard. It's hard to get the most out of these things. And I guess the thing I worry about is if there is a patient or the loved one of a patient who's going to these conferences and saying, I really want to see what's at the cutting edge of my or my loved one's disease, are you going to actually be able to accomplish that at these? And sometimes I'm not so sure.
Yeah, I'm really excited that the first one I went to was this Targeted Therapies conference it's in California. It's this beautiful scenery. And while it is really large still, probably 1,000 plus people, definitely felt really intimate compared to these larger oncology conferences like ASCO. And it really facilitates more communication and downtime with other oncologists from all parts of the country and world. And that was a great experience and launching pad for me, because it was just really great to see my oncologist at the conference in the hallway, see you in the hallway, and just kind of build a sense of community that the larger conferences would be a challenge. So that is somewhere, if I was advising a new patient who wants to learn more, I think we probably agree that from a medical standpoint, there are probably better ways, although it is a useful exercise to kind of learn for yourself and see what the conferences are like. But it's way more about the networking and community aspect. I have met a number of patients at these conferences, and I look forward to seeing them at the next conference, and the patient advocacy groups who attend, who are so ahead in their patient engagement and understanding of the clinical research for their area. It's such a great opportunity to connect with them.
Yeah, and I think you raise a good point about maybe the sweet spot of size. I can see if I didn't know much about these conferences, thinking that the largest conference where there's the most data would be the most effective. You're going to at least have access to more shots to see if something could be useful for you. But the flip side of that is they're almost impossible to navigate. ASCO is a great conference, but it is huge. The thing that you may be interested in, maybe half a mile down the hallways in a conference room that's really hard to find, out of several hundred other either talks or posters or, events that might be happening within a given hour, you have to navigate where those are and how to find them. And if you're in a niche area, it may be feasible to do that if you can look ahead and kind of plot it all out. But you're not going to show up on day one and figure all these things out if you don't have a plan ahead of time. Whereas some of these smaller conferences, so if yourself or your loved one has a tumor type and they have a dedicated conference for it, and you may have to figure out what umbrella that fits in. For example, if it's testicular cancer, is it under a genitourinary conference? They may not have a dedicated testicular cancer conference. They might. But those kind of smaller ones may give you more access to the oncologists, the up-to-date stuff in your area. It may not be totally cutting edge, but the people will be there and the connections will be there. And you probably will have the chance to talk to the oncologists there and get their thoughts. I think one of the benefits of the conference we were just at is, the heads of the field are all chatting with people at the poster session. And there's nothing preventing you from going to the department heads at all the big, cancer centers and, running into them and just saying, I was just curious about your, be respectful about it, but you can, have a question answered, and in a pretty informal setting and see them a little more as people than the traditional patient environment. I'm curious if you saw that conference as an opportunity to do that. I'm a little remiss to recommend people hunt us down at meetings so we don't have 200 patients waiting at the door to get second opinions. It's certainly not it's certainly not the standpoint for that. But did you have the opportunity to chat with experts about given topics?
Definitely. It felt like a great opportunity to kind of put yourself in a somewhat uncomfortable position sometimes is an opportunity for growth. And when I attend these conferences and I think of a question and I'm scared to ask it, and this nervousness in my stomach,
Yeah.
and get it. And almost always people appreciate the questions. I think you said there's a clear line of what is respectful, and I don't go up to the top scientist and researcher and say, here's my mom's case, can I ask for advice? So there's a fine line, and I think there's a lot of opportunity to get value while not crossing it. So it's really, I think, the challenge from a patient or even caregiver. I mean, it's a huge investment of time, resources. This specific conference, IASLC, Targeted Therapies, they actually offer free registration for caregivers and patients, which is really nice. So they want patients to come with that type of promotion. And other conferences do discounted pricing, but I live in New York. I had to travel all the way across the country, pay for a hotel room, leave my wife, and also it's had a huge impact on my career. And to contrast that for a patient, it's a huge impact. How they spend their time is so important. It's almost everything. And I'm curious how you think about that. You mentioned 10 to 20 conferences. How do you manage that many conferences with raising a family and all your patients that you need to see every week? I mean, that sounds like a huge burden.
Yeah, we don't go to them all. So most we can't attend just because there's way too many. But also, following up on what you were mentioning of the time burden, the cost burden, and one thing I want to maybe dig into a little bit more is I think there is a perception out there that if you're a patient, attending these conferences will almost certainly give you information about some cutting edge thing that they may have access to that they're only going to encounter by looking at the latest research. And I'm not so sure that's true. So I'm curious your thoughts as someone who's looking for opportunities for a loved one. Do you find them at these conferences, or do you find that these conferences are reiterating things you already know?
So I feel very fortunate that I and my mom is getting care at MSK, and their institution is this ivory tower of the standard of care. So when guidelines are updated, I'm quite confident that they're going to be either initiated and led by research happening at MSK, or they're going to be one of the first to follow.
Mm-hmm.
Most patients, and a lot of patients I do meet at these conferences who come from community hospital settings and rural areas, there really is a learning curve, a learning gap of what the priorities for that patient is, and what's the proper cadence of testing, and the significance of NGS testing, and what type of biomarkers are you looking for. And so while I think most patients would probably know what the latest approved targeted therapy is if they have a biomarker, I think in a lot of hospital settings, there probably is a knowledge gap where they wouldn't be aware of maybe a trial that's happening relevant to their specific cancer. And I think I have in a lot of patients in these academic centers probably have that luxury.
How do you think that the knowledge gained from these national meetings compares to the knowledge of the patient advocacy groups?
Well, what's interesting is these patient advocacy groups all attend these annual meetings and they have such a strong presence. So that for a lot of patients, and myself included, I trust the patient advocates who I trust, and the fact that they attend these meetings is really valuable and helpful for me. One, they can understand the material and research in a way that I can't, and I'm learning to. And then also they take that back to their individual communities. So I think that's a great source of life for patients all over, that you have these dedicated patient advocates and support groups who attend all these conferences and then bring that knowledge back to their respective communities.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's such a great asset to the clinical care community that if you have a rare disease and you're living in an area that doesn't have a specialist, you can almost farm out some of that specialist knowledge through these patient advocacy organizations. And I'm not saying it's the same as someone who focuses on that and they're able to make a career out of seeing those kind of specialized groups of individuals who have something potentially rare. But it can help be a bridge. Many community oncologists aren't going to know about the latest approval for something that's really rare if they're treating lung cancer, breast cancer, leukemia, sarcomas. Then for them to know, has there been a recent approval in EGFR exon 20, in the last 6 months to a year? That's going to be tough for them to keep up with that. It's not a stigma against them. It's just it's the nature of how quickly medicine is evolving. But if you're plugged into some of these patient advocacy organizations like the Exon 20 group, which you're plugged into, you'll hear about that before your oncologist will, almost certainly. And I think that's a really positive element. So I think while these national meetings, I think I think they are good to attend if you can. But I don't want to give the sense that that's the only place to get the most cutting edge information that's been distilled, interpreted through an intelligent lens, and then made pragmatic for you. Because I think the patient advocacy organizations do attend these, and they do offer that refinement process for the new information, and they send it to their crew there. And I think that's amazing. I meet with a lot of them when I'm there too.
Yeah, a lot of these support groups also will have their own version of an annual meeting. So if someone has colorectal cancer and the Colorectal Cancer Alliance does an annual meeting in Miami, that's a great opportunity for a patient to fully immerse themselves. And that's less of a medical research oriented role. It's going to really cover all the aspects of cancer survivorship. But then what's great about those annual meetings, and I haven't been to so many of them because one, Exon 20 is so small, so we don't really have the community to throw an annual meeting. But I know EGFR resistors, they just did their first annual meeting, and I'm definitely going to look to attend the upcoming one in August. These annual meetings are for the patient advocacy group are a great channel for patients because they're going to curate all the content to make sure that their patients are getting the best care. So they might invite you to speak at the EGFR resistors annual meeting if you're doing research in EGFR, and that could be a great opportunity for you to get your name and brand as an oncologist out there. And then all the other support programming that they offer is something I would recommend to a lot of patients if they're thinking about if you had to pick one type of conference to go to. It's, can you find the right support group and go to one of their annual meeting.
Yeah, I think that's a great example, and I agree entirely. These patient advocacy organizations will frequently attend many, if not all, of the big national meetings. So their particular meeting, if they're large enough to have one, will be a distilled version of everything they've seen. And they're also in communication with a lot of the oncologists. EGFR Sisters is a great example. Same with Exon 20. I speak with them pretty regularly myself. So they're plugged in pretty well. And I agree. I think that's probably a better avenue for if you have to choose one conference, choose the patient advocacy one that's around the specific thing that you're treating. And that will be a distilled version because the breadth of what's at these meetings is so wide. I mean, we were meeting at this targeted therapies meeting, which is a pretty niche subset of one disease type. So it's the targeted therapies that work in lung cancer. And even still, it was several days worth of lectures, 20, 30 posters, and how many pharma groups are there trying to advocate?
Dozens.
Yeah, advocate for what they're doing. So even that alone is a lot. And then if you take that scope and then you go to the American Society for Clinical Oncology annual meeting, ASCO, or the American Association of Cancer Research, AACR, which is somewhat in the middle size, but more research oriented, like laboratory based stuff. Those are many times that size because it's not just lung cancer now. Now it's everything. So you're getting, probably dozens to hundreds of lectures. And whether or not this cutting edge cool thing is applicable to your patient's tumor type for us, or your tumor type if you're the patient, it's not a guarantee that these things that sound really cool and sound really promising are either going to be ready for prime time anytime soon, and if they are going to be trialed in your disease type. So I think these big national meetings, you hear a lot of whisperings of things that are really promising, but again, if they're going to be directly applicable to you or your loved one, a lot of times that's a bit of a stretch.
I'm curious your perspective on you mentioned how many pharma sponsors were at this meeting. I went to the World Lung Conference, also an IASLC event. It was in Barcelona, which was a really, really cool experience. And the presence of the pharmaceutical companies was mind blowing.
Yeah.
As a patient and caregiver, it was totally above my head. The booths were the size of houses, and the programming they had, it was really impressive. But as a provider and kind of medical researcher, is that a great opportunity for you to interface with these pharmaceutical companies to kind of connect and learn more about what they're working on?
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword. I think that it makes it very abundant that this is a business, that they're there sponsoring these events. They pay for that space, and the bigger the space, generally, the more they're paying. And they want their brand seen. They want to pitch the drugs that they're selling in hopes that the oncologist will prescribe them, or hopes that any patients that are there will ask their oncologist to receive them. So there's no, and I don't think they would deny that. Like we know the system in the United States. So on one hand, it's a little challenging to swallow that when you go to these big national conventions where we're all supposed to be coming together to talk about our research, the first thing you're going to notice is pharma. The big banners are all pharma. You walk into the main conference halls, and the center is pharma, and then you go out, and a lot of times that's how it's kind of splayed out there. So I just want to swallow that pill before we dive on to the main course here. That it is a business, and it's clear it's a business. That being said, they are the ones who make the medicine. So if you're one who wants to research the medicine, like myself and my colleagues, they're the ones to talk to, and they're the ones that do take on the risks for trials and for maybe cutting edge ways to look at the trials they've done before, or cutting edge ways to take the medicines they have and repurpose them in a new way that you think may be more effective. So it really is a good opportunity for people like me, meaning a physician who runs trials and such, to meet with them and to talk about what are the trials they already have going, and is that something we can bring to our institution? Does that work with the competing landscape in a given area? For example, if someone has a lung cancer with a particular mutation, many companies are going to have a medicine against that. So it's my job to meet with those companies and try to figure out, which trial do we want to have so I can best serve my patients. And at these national meetings, they're all there. So a lot of times that's what you're going to see the researchers doing, at least the ones who are running trials, is we're going to be meeting with all the big names, the Bristol Myers Squibbs, the Pfizer, the Eli Lilly, all these people, hearing about what's in their pipelines, and is there something coming up that our center might be a good candidate for that would serve our patient population. With that is definitely the premise, or I suppose the consideration, that they're trying to build relationships with us, so we'll continue to work with their trials. I think there's a perception in the community that the biggest consideration, or the only consideration, I should say, in starting a trial is how well the medicine works. And that is definitely the biggest consideration, but it's not the only consideration. How well the trial group is to work with, how easy things are to get off the ground. You also have to have the pragmatic elements of running a trial, which is not an easy thing to do. If you're having a lot of delays with the sponsor who's sponsoring the trial, well, maybe even if they have a great drug, if the patients can't get it in a timely fashion, we may not work with them. So you're also developing relationships with pharmaceutical companies. Do I have the right person to reach out to if I have a problem? Do they seem receptive? Are they amenable to any of the conditions or the nuances of our given site? So I think there's a lot of communication with pharma, and the hope on both sides is to make things work as well as it can. I don't want to give the perception that the pharmaceutical companies are there twisting their mustache, trying to figure out how to squeeze patients for every penny. That's not what they're doing, truly. But it is also a for-profit model. So they are trying to advocate for their medicines. But I think you're spot on. That's a lot of what we do at these conferences, is try to figure out who has what and what gaps do we have at our institution that we need to fill.
It's really interesting from a patient perspective, because obviously the IASLC, who coordinates, puts these conferences together. They make it easy for patients to attend and promote patients attending. And then also it is sponsored by pharma companies. And it's hard when I see a pharma company that has an exon 20 drug and I'll ask them about it. It's kind of unclear how much they can talk to me about the drug. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because there was a specific example. Johnson & Johnson has a exon 20 drug called amivantamab, and my mom hasn't been on it yet, but we're considering it. And I'm in the amivantamab Facebook group, and there's a ton of cases of toxicity from the drug. So many patients reporting skin rash and certain other adverse effects. And it concerns me that this is what is next in line for my mom.
Yep.
And I would, at this conference, just the Targeted Therapies conference, one of the Johnson & Johnson reps there fully had a conversation with me about the toxicity of the drug, and that they're constantly working on ways to improve it. And they've worked on a cocoon protocol, I think it's called, as a way to explore how to mitigate the adverse effects. And one oncologist, maybe it was one of the patient advocates, mentioned, they're really owning up to it and trying to do everything they can to help mitigate the adverse effects and be upfront with patients. And it going to the conference actually changed my perspective, that I was able to have this conversation with a representative there. And I understand the data still, that 40+% of patients going on this have this reaction. But now there was a human speaking to me about it. And that was an interesting experience. And I wish more pharma companies did that and do that at these types of conferences, and for patients to feel comfortable to lean into those conversations.
Yeah, you raise a good point. I think that's a particularly good example. And the the patient you're thinking of is actually my boss. So we have an episode on here with Dr. Ross Camage, who is he's the chair of my clinic in this here at the University of Colorado, and he has EGFR-driven lung cancer, and he was on that drug. And in this conference, he showed images of his toxicity, of the swelling, of the skin rashes, of all the challenges he was having, and even as an oncologist, he was really, really struggling with managing those toxicities. So, and he mentioned that company in particular did a very good job of owning their toxicity, and he advocated that more companies do that. I'll say that's not terribly common that a drug company is going to highlight the elements of their drug that might make you not choose it. So usually my experience with pharma at these meetings is they're not really going to say anything negative about their compound or whatever they're pitching. And me as a researcher, I've done research on different data sets, and I've identified patients who may not respond very well to a given drug. And it's a very rare company that's willing to say, okay, let's investigate further who may not benefit from our drug. Like, they still are profit driven. And the types of things they're going to engage in and the types of research they're going to support, I think at its core does have to feed into that. And it's not always, they don't always do that, but to overcome the pressure to meet stakeholder things. I mean, imagine the news article that comes out if someone from this company is speaking negatively about their own drug. That could potentially be spun in a very negative way that could hurt shareholder assets. So I think they dance a very fine line. And I think my first perception when I first entered into that big national meeting or any of these big national meetings was I was really disheartened by seeing how much of it was pharma and learning of how much these national meetings are a profit-driven business. People come there to present their data. They come there to learn about data, but also the people who are running the meetings make a ton of money on them. Like, there's no denying that. It's rare, what you were mentioning, where a group will pay for patients to attend, and the patients will attend for free because there's food there. There's other things that they're paying for, and they're just eating the cost if they're giving you free admission, and that's space that otherwise could be filled by someone who's paying. So I think it's a rare event where patients are offered free admittance, and many of the other national conferences, they do not do that. And I'm not sure they could. I think if it was free for someone to attend the ASCO, our American Society for Clinical Oncology, and you got 10,000 patients coming, then we wouldn't have room and we wouldn't be able to do some of the other things. I think another critic of that might say, well, maybe you could have less pharma in there and you'd have more room, but then you wouldn't have the pharma paying functionally for the conference. So it's a tough balancing act. And I think it's something that's really easy, I've learned over time, to look from the outside in and judge how these things are set up and run. But they're not easy things to coordinate, getting tens and tens of thousands of people in one building at once and the lights staying on and everything working and transportation and all these meetings happening. But if you're going there thinking that this is a bunch of researchers and clinicians and patients coming together to sit in meetings and discuss how to overcome the biggest problems together, that's probably not what's happening.
Yeah, the orchestration is really so impressive. Just the digital asset components, the transitioning between different rooms and speakers. It was really an impressive operation.
Yeah. And I think to the credit of these meetings, usually there is something for everyone. They'll have some element of being able to meet with the pharmaceutical companies, and that is important. They're the ones who make the medicines. Like, we need to work with them really well. And then you'll have some element of things that are coming up through the pipelines, what's hot in the coming field, and research is moving at a reasonably good pace these days, but it's not so fast that you're going to see something different from month to month. And then you have usually the element of what's happening in trials and where can I go to get those trials to some degree. It's certainly not highlighted such that every important trial is shown. Now, you probably noticed that even at this lung meeting, they do not mention the vast majority of trials.
Yeah, and then this kind of relates to the example I brought up when they do discuss trials and they're thinking about how to bring them to the patients. It's really interesting how they curate these trials, the inclusion and exclusion criteria, by creating certain subsets of patients. They're almost trying to prop up their drug. And because you mentioned it's, the pharmaceutical companies aren't necessarily picking the patients or investing in how to explore what drugs don't work for a patient.
Right.
But I'd almost say if you look at the inclusion exclusion criteria of a trial, it's probably constructed in a way so that they're only bringing patients who are most likely to benefit from the drug. And then in later phase, when they test it in broader populations, you see maybe higher adverse reactions. And this particular company that has been very upfront and forward about it was probably damage control and
Yeah.
a pretty extreme case.
Yeah, and I think you're right. If you're astute, you can probably look at the inclusion and exclusion criteria of a trial and figure out what they're trying to steer away from. Because the goal of these companies when they're running these trials is they want the trial to be positive. They think it's going to be positive, but they also want to make sure that they're excluding out foreseeable risk. So if they have a certain condition that they think isn't going to tolerate the medicine well, like you have a comorbidity, you have, I'm going to make something up, you have cardiovascular disease, and this may lead to more cardiovascular events if you take this drug, they're going to exclude those people. They may benefit from the drug just fine, but they don't want the added toxicity in the trial. They don't want deaths in the trial leading to the drug being discontinued when they could have just said, hey, be extra cautious if you have this thing. So I think it's important, and the impetus is on us as the researchers, the clinicians who are prescribing these medicines, and increasingly so the patients who are getting more knowledgeable about the field and advocating for themselves, is to look through those criteria carefully and say, was me, the person who would fit my criteria, would I be allowed on this trial? And many times you'll see no. And a lot of times it could be someone who has a brain metastasis, someone who has a history of an autoimmune condition. Those are getting excluded out of trials really frequently. Those kinds of things. And then you'll find that the trial data is, to borrow your term, very curated. These are usually the healthiest of the healthy people. And that's a lot of what you're going to see at these conferences, is you're going to see the best looking data, things being shown in the best possible light that they can. And I think the way the field progresses necessitates that. We need to see the most accurate sign of if there is signal or not in something. So I think it's a challenging step for someone who's trying to identify, is this thing going to benefit me? But in terms of moving the field forward and learning the most we can about the biology and how we can best use the new tools we have, having that kind of ideal data set is probably the best way we can do it, at least in those initial steps.
So I think this is going to tie back to actually why I went to my first conference. It was because I was advocating on behalf of my mom, who fell into a category of patients that were deemed risky.
Mm-hmm.
And by actually being at the conference and being able to advocate for her that, she's not damaged goods, and these trials, while they're designed to prove a certain level of efficacy, I have this hope that by putting all these different stakeholders in the room, and a lot of it might have to stem also from FDA reform and kind of broader level regulatory reform. But why not introduce certain subsets of, instead of building this ideal data set, you could build two subsets for a trial. You have this ideal data set portion, and then you have another subset that has certain risks of comorbidities, and nothing that would be risky to the patient, but risky potentially to the results of the trial. And in that way, if the FDA was willing to work with companies on this, I think that's a great outcome and an opportunity for patients who almost always will fall under these. It's more likely than not you fall under the uh, risky category, or just tying it back to the point I was trying to make, which is there should be an opportunity to do both to prove the efficacy of the trials, and these research meetings being a coming together of patients who may not be the most perfect ideal patients, but still giving them an opportunity for a drug that would benefit them and still progress research.
Yeah, and I'll say tying it back to the attending clinical trials theme here, if you're someone who's advocating for that kind of reform, the people who are running the trials are at these meetings. And it may not be who you think it is. You may think that the people speaking at the podiums are the right people to talk to for this decision making, but many times the person standing at a poster for the 3 hour time period we have to stand there when we're presenting data. So the person who's not on the podium but is in this big gallery of hundreds and hundreds of posters, that person may own the company. Like depending on who is out there, sometimes the chair of our departments is out there just standing by the poster showing the data that they had in this given set. And you may be able to just go and say, oh, this was a phase 1. I see you excluded individuals who have brain metastases or something. That's a very common example. You can say, well, why, do you think it doesn't work in brain metastases? Oh, well, we think it actually does. Well, my loved one has brain metastases. I would love for them to be on this trial. In the next phase, are you opening up a cohort for that? And the more pressure perceived by the decision makers, this is, I think, one possible avenue to implement that positive change. Although, in the lens of what you're going to be benefiting from attending these meetings, that's something that's more improving, I think, the culture of academic medicine and our duty and service to our patients rather than necessarily benefiting yourself. So it's still a good service, I think, but that trial you're advocating for may not be around when you need it. That's not a guarantee. But still, I mean, you do have access to the individuals who make the decisions.
To kind of build off that, I over the last year, I kind of realized these conferences have been a form of therapy for me. It's been therapeutic to attend these and thinking about impact more broadly. So while advocating to the trial coordinator for zipalertinib wasn't going to have an impact on Taiho Oncology's phase 2/3 clinical trial, having that discussion was in advocating for the community was really meaningful for me. And I'd say all patients and their caregivers are different. My mom specifically would never be interested in attending one of these conferences, but she still lives her life each day with meaning. And this is a way for me to kind of channel that.
Yeah, and I would say you may be surprised at how much weight your voice lends. The people who are working on designing these trials, particularly if the trial is being run at an academic center and so you have a couple of different types of trials. Some are from the sponsor and they, have their statisticians and they work everything out. This is the sample size we need. They get feedback, but they're the ones offering the trial to you. And then there's another set where an academic group may have a trial that they're initiating themselves. And it's just a couple people that are, best figuring out how to do this. And if there's, I hate to use the term pressure, but influence from the patient advocacy organizations or from individuals themselves to say, look, unless you think this is prohibitive to include this element of risk, using the term brain mets, if you think it's really going to tank your trial to include individuals with brain metastases, we appreciate it may be a little bit of extra work to separate that out in the data, but it would mean a ton to us to consider that. That matters. That counts. At the end of the day, it's all people working together to make decisions. And the whole reason that at least we in academic oncology got into this was to be a service for patients. And I think if you can tie into that sentiment, and it doesn't destroy the potential for the trial, then people are going to hear that.
It makes a lot of sense. And I obviously further highlights the value that patient advocacy groups can provide for people also not attending the conference. They really advocate on their behalf.
Yeah, and getting back to the conference stuff, what would you say is the most beneficial thing that a patient will get from attending one of these conferences?
For me, it's really been the sense of community. And just in 1 year, the difference of walking down the hallway and being excited about the networking breaks where I didn't know who to sit next to and I didn't know 99.9% of the faces, to just this past year being excited to see a number of the patients who are attending, being excited to see the oncologists and like yourself who I've met, and just being more comfortable. So I think that's something really special that someone could get out of these conferences. It's certainly been uh, therapeutic in a way to feel like I can be a voice and have an impact by attending and representing the my mom, and then also broader patient populations. And people ask me, other patients who I help, they know I'm attending the conference, and they ask me, "How did it go? Did you learn anything?" And just sharing an update with them when I'm done has a big impact on them and bringing them up to speed. And so I think there's certainly a lot of opportunity for patients and their caregivers to attend these types of conferences.
Yeah, I mean I agree, and I think for most people you're not going to go there and find the thing that you should be on instead of what you are on. It's unlikely you're going to go there and find, oh, this new medicine that my oncologist doesn't know about. That's I'm going to get my hands on it. That's probably not going to happen. It might, truly, it might, but for the most people, that's not going to be the outcome. I will say that for some of these conferences that are international and there's more of the preclinical research element to it, for those who have money to do things out of pocket, it can offer an opportunity to collaborate with laboratories across the world to do special things. You can find individuals who can profile tumors in certain ways, who can make models out of tumors, and people will do that with patient tumors. It's something that I've had patients who have had their tumors modeled. We've done it for patients, and it's not a it's not a guarantee that you're going to go to these meetings and find one of these technological advancements that may help you. But it is something that if you keep your eye for it, you may see something that interests you. Just keep in mind, a lot of what you're going to see at these meetings is not FDA approved things. This is all research. So if you wanted to apply it to your case, you're going to be paying out of pocket. And a lot of times it's going to be information that isn't fully validated in any approved system. And the way it's going to benefit you is going to be theoretical. It might help, it might not. So I want to be clear. I think I advocate for academic research. I do it. I think it really matters. But if I had someone's cell lines in my hands and we're looking at things that may or may not work on their specific tumor, I would have a big grain of salt to say, what happens in the patient isn't always what's going to happen in the research lab.
I was going to say my initial reaction to that question of what are the benefits, I actually didn't include. I mentioned this on our last time I was on this podcast, that I actually did learn about a drug at that first conference and a way of accessing that drug at a country. And I can really appreciate, after going to so many of these, how rare and unique that was. And I don't know whether it was fate or it just really incredible that I feel like I was that one in a million person. So people should still dream for those types of scenarios. And I didn't answer the question and mention that first, which is crazy because it actually was the case for me in that first conference I went to. So I think patients who are attending these conferences, they should look through that lens, but certainly have the level set expectation. And there's so much more that I answered in that question about community and just putting yourself in the best position surrounding patient advocates and oncology teams who are there, that's for sure, I know, going to be a value for patients who attend.
Yeah. No, thanks for elaborating on that. Because I wasn't even thinking of it through that lens too, but you certainly were one of the rare cases where you identified something that could work, and then it wasn't available here, and you found where it was available. And the only way that was going to happen was, either through these conferences or patient advocacy, some level of putting yourself out there to obtain that information. But going to the conferences puts you in touch with the people, the connections to make those things happen.
Right. And I'll add that it's gotten a bit easier over time, but there certainly is a huge emotional aspect to attending these conferences. When you first get a cancer diagnosis or a loved one does, they tell you don't Google, don't look at 5 year survival rates on Google. It's outdated. And when you go to a conference, the statistics you're seeing are actually the most up to date. And when you see 5 year survival rates going from 10% to 20% and how amazing that is as a patient or a caregiver for a patient, it's like really scary, and it's sad. It's like in that moment, it's like, wait, it's 20%. And then certain reactions to the drugs and how long people are on these drugs being quantified in a matter of months, it really paints just like a really picture of how serious of a disease we're working with, and battling that at these conferences is certainly tough at times.
Yeah, I've heard this before too, is that the benefits that you'll see a standing ovation for are really sad. Like in an absolute perspective of, for a certain disease that may have a 12-month survival, moving that to 15 months or 16 months, you're going to see a standing ovation from thousands of people at some of these big conferences. And from a patient or caregiver perspective, that is not the major breakthrough you're hoping for. Like, you take your W's where you get them, but people are looking for large changes that, dramatically change the landscape, not usually 3 months of added life with toxicities and, getting infusions every 2 weeks. So, and that's a lot of what you may see at these conferences, particularly if you're new to the field and you don't know the full landscape of the disease that you or your loved one may have. So yeah, I think we get a little jaded in the research community because it's so hard to get anything that works. And I think that's a really underappreciated element of this field, is just finding anything that does anything is really, really hard. And that's why the cost of pharma is so much. They're investing billions into each drug, and the number of drugs that fail before they get one into trial is tremendous. And then that's why you see them here pitching the one thing that got through, because they've been working on something in a given disease type for 10 years. 90% of them failed before they went to trial. And then 90% of the things that went into trial failed. And out of billions and billions of dollars, they have one drug. And they really, really need people to pay for that, or else they can't exist as a company. So then you see them marketing, and then you get mad at them for marketing at these clinical conferences. So no, it's tough, but I think it does. I appreciate you pointing out the nature of the benefits we are seeing and kind of how dismal they can be.
Yeah, there's this expectation, a hope we're going to find a cure, and everyone's working towards it. But what's really challenging at times is when my dad or family member, someone asks me, "So, what did you learn from the conference?" Like, they're so proud and excited that I'm attending, and oh, progression-free survival went from 6 to 9 months on this new drug. It's really hard to bring back that information and get excited around it. But I think the perspective I feel I've learned over this past year is just how valuable those 3 extra months are, because this past year of being on this new drug has been a total blessing. And every additional month that my mom is on this drug is a gift for all of us. So if I could rewind the time and put myself in the shoes at that conference, it's impossible to quantify the marginal benefits. So I would say to contrast that, as while you're kind of hoping for a cure, every marginal improvement is so significant, and patients should also look at it in that lens as well.
No, I appreciate that perspective because I think for at least y'all use our disease type as the example. In lung cancer, it took 30, 40 years of just having chemotherapy before we had anything that wasn't chemotherapy. And people rarely lived longer than a year. And that stigma is still around today, where people say if you're diagnosed with lung cancer, you're not going to make it to your next Christmas or whatever. And now we have people, depending on what's driving the cancer, living many years. And that came out of many iterations of incremental benefit, where you went from 12 months to 15 months. And then the next thing came out, it went from 15 months to 19 months, and then 23 months, and then 3 years. And any of them given alone don't look terribly impressive. And when I think patients see the standing ovation for the 3-month benefit, if you're pretty new to this, it may be hard to reconcile that. But if you've been in it for years, you see how hard it was to get that. So yeah, I appreciate that other perspective, because I have heard this a lot from patients and caregivers that why are you excited over a 2-month benefit or a 3-month benefit, and that's the big reason why.
Just going to these conferences, it has an emotional weight, and it isn't necessarily for everyone, and how people choose to select their time and live their life is so important and personalized. It's had such a great impact for me kind of going through these learnings. And another takeaway should be that just the value of patient advocates there. It's been great to see how many people attend these conferences on behalf of patients, and that's comforting.
Yeah, and I think some people cope with challenge through intellectualizing. I do. Whenever I have something that I'm really struggling with, breaking it down into analytical pieces and looking at it objectively helps me decouple what to do from the emotional consequences of those decisions. And I kind of compartmentalize. The emotions are in one place and then the action items are in a different place. And I think for that kind of person, these kind of conferences can be really good. If you can look at the data, you can see what's coming up, and you can put together in your mind, okay, this thing leads to an incremental improvement in that much. But it has to be through that, I think, or maybe it's best through that intellectualization lens. Whereas if you're looking at this as this may be the thing that does or doesn't save me, that may be really hard at these conferences, because you're going to see a lot of negative results. You're going to see a lot of trials where what we tried, we thought was really promising, didn't work, too much toxicity, and you're going to see those mostly in the posters because they weren't accepted for the talks. So, there's also that double-edged sword of seeing all of the things, or many of the things at these conferences that you had hope in and didn't pan out.
Right.
And maybe before we wrap up here, Max, any last words of recommendation or wisdom for patients or patient caregivers who may be interested in attending one of these trials, or one of these conferences, rather?
I think it's really try to understand what it is that you're interested in learning and achieving from the trial, because it is really daunting to show up on that first day and the schedule being there and not understanding a lot of whether it's medical jargon or just how these conferences are structured. So there are so many different types of conferences, and I think for each patient, lean into what speaks most to you. Whether there's some foundations that are very public policy facing, and they march on Congressional Hill and they advocate on behalf of lung cancer research. There are conferences really focused on the specific type of cancer you have and talk about survivorship and how to navigate financial hardships. And then kind of the engineer in me was particularly leaning. I've attended most of these conferences, but the ones that are medical research, I've enjoyed it particularly as well. So really just internalize and think about what speaks to you, and utilize any sense of community you have already, whether it's a Facebook group. Ask in the Facebook group, is anyone attending this conference? Is there one that you would attend? And that way, having a partner or someone you know at the conference would be great too.
Yeah, sounds great. And one other element I should add is that for many of these conferences, there are options to attend virtually. So if you can't, afford or the time for the flight and all these kinds of things, if that's not you, you may be able to attend remotely, so to speak. You can watch the lectures, you can go through all of the poster presentations, and then you can identify things that, you could either bring up with your oncology team, talk to the patient advocacy groups about, and you can get a lot of benefit that way at a fraction of the time and a fraction of the cost, but you don't necessarily get the community element.
Right.
Okay. Well, hey, Max, thanks so much for joining today. I think this was a great conversation about everything that goes on in the conferences and what people may hope to get out of them and what may not necessarily be seen there. So I think your perspective as someone who's been there, real boots on the ground, they're trying to help someone close to you, absolutely invaluable. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
All right. We'll see you next time, everybody.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Cracking Cancer. If you found this helpful, please like, subscribe, leave us a review, and visit crackingcancer.org for more information. Every dollar we earn goes directly to furthering the podcast and supporting vital cancer research. Because together, we can crack cancer.